The first thing Malcolm Reed noticed was the smell, faint, sweet, and wrong. The kind of scent that didn't belong in a storage unit that had been locked for more than a decade. When he cracked open the crate in the back corner, he expected dust and rot. What he found instead looked like a sleeping child, carved with impossible care, her braids neat and her small hands folded under her cheek. But something about her didn't feel like art. The skin caught the light too naturally. The lashes cast real shadows. By the time the hair began to grow, Malcolm already knew whatever this thing was, it had once been alive. Under the flickering light of the corridor, Malcolm Reed pulled the steel latch and felt the old padlock snap loose in his hand. The hallway smelled like damp cardboard and stale Freon, a familiar perfume of abandonment. Peach State Storage was quiet that morning, the hum of the air conditioners mixing with the distant hiss of traffic on I-75. The unit he was about to open hadn't been touched since 1977. He knew because the ledger still bore the name of a man long dead, a renter who'd paid cash for a year and then vanished. 11 years of unpaid fees and unanswered notices. It was just another forgotten space in a row of forgotten spaces. Malcolm braced his boots against the concrete, lifted the corrugated door, and a wave of cold air rolled out from the dark. Inside, the unit looked like the ghost of someone's obsession. Crates stacked neatly against the walls, each labeled in precise handwriting, glassware, tools, instruments. A tall wooden box sat in the back, unlike the others, polished oak, reinforced corners, and a brass plate screwed to its front. The lettering was faded but still legible. Memorial Art Piece, commissioned 1976. Handle with reverence. Malcolm frowned. He'd seen all kinds of things in these units: furniture, tax records, broken televisions, but never anything that carried a warning like that. He switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust, and felt a small twist in his stomach. The air inside smelled faintly metallic, like dried blood or old coins. He took out his camera and began cataloging, as company policy required. Each photo clicked and echoed softly in the empty corridor. The crates contained preserved animals: foxes, birds, even a small dog under glass. Taxidermy work, meticulous but unsettling. Whoever R. Fallen had been, he was more craftsman than hoarder. Malcolm crouched beside the large oak box and noticed the lid was sealed with brass clasps. The kind you'd see on a coffin. Handle with reverence, he muttered to himself, almost laughing. Then curiosity won over good sense. He loosened the clasps, lifted the lid a few inches, and froze. The beam of his flashlight landed on the face of a little girl. She lay on her side, eyes closed, as if dreaming. The skin, if that's what it was, had a soft glow, too smooth, too perfect. She wore faded jeans and a lilac sweater with embroidered flowers. Her braids framed her cheeks, each one tied with a tiny white bead. For a moment, Malcolm thought it must be wax. Some artist's morbid tribute. He'd seen wax figures before, but none that looked like this. The texture of her skin caught the light differently, not like resin, but like something warm that had once cooled. He stepped back, heart hammering in his throat. He told himself it was just art. Someone's strange, expensive art piece left behind. He'd write it down, take a few pictures, move on. But as he raised the camera, he noticed small details that didn't fit: tiny pores along her temple, a faint freckle on her chin, the natural curve of her fingernails. It was too much. Too real. He lowered the camera and stared until the light from his flashlight began to flicker. The silence inside the unit felt thick, heavy enough to press against his ribs. Finally, he closed the lid and stepped out into the hall, locking the unit behind him. Back in the office, Malcolm tried to shake it off. He uploaded the photos to the storage database, filled out the report, and labeled the crate for valuation. Maybe it was worth something. Maybe a museum would want it. But that night, when the facility was quiet and the hum of the vents was the only sound, he kept seeing her face behind his eyelids. The delicate lashes, the softness of her mouth, the way the light seemed to breathe across her skin. He told himself he was just tired. Over the next few days, employees drifted into gawk at the statue. Carlos from maintenance said it looked like a movie prop. Maria from the front desk swore the artist had to be famous. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was too lifelike to be comfortable. They started calling it the sleeping girl. Malcolm laughed with them, but he avoided looking directly at her whenever he passed through the back room. Something about the crate drew his eyes and repelled them at the same time, like staring into the open mouth of a well. 2 weeks later, on a slow Wednesday afternoon, Carlos poked his head into Malcolm's office. "Hey man," he said, half smiling, half nervous. "Is it just me, or does that doll's hair look longer?" Malcolm blinked. "What? I'm serious," Carlos said. "When you first brought it in, the braids were like chin length. Now they reach down past her shoulders. You sure that thing isn't made out of, I don't know, something weird?" Malcolm waved him off, laughing it away. "Hair doesn't grow on statues, man. You're reimagining things." But after Carlos left, Malcolm found himself staring through the small window into the back storage area. The crate sat exactly where he'd left it. Still, a thin chill crawled up his arms. That evening, he pulled out the first photo he'd taken and compared it to the view inside the crate. The camera didn't lie, the braids were shorter in the picture. He measured them with a ruler. In the current view, they were almost 6 inches longer. His mouth went dry. Maybe humidity had made the fibers stretch, he thought. Maybe it was optical illusion, lighting, anything. But deep down, he didn't believe his own reasoning. Something was happening inside that box, and he couldn't explain it. For 3 nights in a row, he dreamed of the girl. In his dreams, she wasn't lying still anymore. She was sitting up, her hair loose and wild, whispering words he couldn't quite hear. Each time, he woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the sound of her soft voice still echoing in his mind. On the 4th night, he couldn't take it. He called his sister Claudia, the nurse, told her to come see it for herself. She arrived with latex gloves and her skeptical smirk. "You and your horror stories," she teased, but when she lifted the lid and touched the girl's hair, her smile faded instantly. "Malcolm, these are real follicles." She leaned closer, tracing her finger along the scalp. "This isn't a sculpture. This is human." The words hung between them, sharp and impossible. Malcolm felt the room tilt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claudia whispered, "You need to call the police. Right now." He hesitated, heart pounding, and then nodded. As he reached for the phone, he glanced one last time into the crate. The girl's expression was peaceful, almost knowing, as if she'd been waiting for someone to finally see her for what she truly was. When the officers arrived that night, Malcolm stood outside the storage facility, smoking in the drizzle, watching the flashing lights stain the wet pavement red and blue. He told them everything: the unpaid unit, the crate, the hair, the discovery. Inside, technicians worked in silence, their gloves squeaking against the wooden edges of the box. One of them muttered something low, and a detective called for a body bag. A body. The word made Malcolm's stomach turn. He looked away. In the days that followed, the news spread quietly through the department. The statue was a preserved human body. A child estimated to have died around 1976. The preservation was masterful, almost artistic. But the story behind it no one could yet explain. And as Malcolm sat in his tiny office, staring at the empty space where the crate had been, he knew this was only the beginning. Whatever truth had been sealed inside that wooden box had been waiting more than a decade to be found. And now that it was free, it wasn't going to rest easy. Malcolm barely slept after the police took the crate away. The image of that girl, of what she really was, stayed behind his eyelids like an afterimage burned into film. Every creak of the building, every groan of the pipes made him think of the wooden box, of the soft hair spilling over the edge. By morning, the facility felt haunted. Not by ghosts, exactly, but by something heavier, the knowledge of what he'd been living with for weeks without realizing it. He went through the motions of his job, collecting rent payments, sorting through dusty invoices, but his mind kept circling back to that lifeless face that wasn't supposed to exist. The police had promised to keep him updated, though he didn't expect to hear much. Cold cases had a way of disappearing again once the headlines faded. 3 days later, Detective Evelyn Ross showed up at the storage office. She looked out of place among the metal doors and fluorescent lights, tall, sharp. Her coat collar turned up against the winter drizzle. She moved like someone who'd seen too much and learned to hide it behind a calm stare. "Mr. Reed," she said, shaking his hand. "I need to ask you a few questions about the contents of Unit 12B. Her voice carried that clipped rhythm of someone used to people lying to her. Malcolm told her everything, how he found the crate, when he opened it, what happened after. She didn't write much down, just listened, eyes scanning his face for any cracks in the story. When he finished, she nodded once. "You did the right thing calling it in," she said, softer now. "Most people wouldn't have." She asked to see the photos he'd taken. He pulled them up on his computer, feeling the familiar knot and tighten in his stomach, as her face appeared on the screen again, sleeping. Perfect. Too human to be art. Ross leaned in, studying every detail. "The hair," she murmured. "You re sure it was shorter when you first opened it?" Malcolm nodded. "I measured it. 6 inches difference, maybe more." Ross straightened, exhaling through her nose. "The medical examiner says decomposition and certain chemicals can cause that illusion. Still, it's a hell of a thing to see." She hesitated, then added, "We rerunning data, but it'll take time. Labs are backed up." A week passed. Rain kept falling, washing Atlanta's streets into a blur of gray and red. Malcolm tried to forget, but the police came by again, then again, asking more questions each time. The last visit, Detective Ross looked different, tired, eyes ringed in sleepless blue. She asked him to sit down. "We got a match," she said quietly. Her name was Amara Lewis, 12 years old, reported missing in 1976. The name hit him like a small explosion in his chest. He didn't know the girl, but now that she had a name, she felt less like a nightmare and more like a person. He imagined her walking home from school, swinging her backpack, never knowing that someone was already watching her. Ross showed him the old missing persons flyer, yellowed paper, grainy black, and white photo of a smiling girl with braids. Even faded, she looked alive, mischievous, like she just told a secret. Her mother filed the report the same night she disappeared, Ross said. The original detective marked it as a probable runaway. Malcolm stared at the word runaway, printed in neat blue ink at the bottom of the report. 12 years old, he said, incredulous. They thought she ran away. Ross gave a bitter smile. Back then, that was the default for black kids in this city. If they weren't rich or white, nobody looked too hard. The words stayed with him long after she left. That night, Malcolm sat alone in his office, scrolling through old newspapers on the microfilm archive. He found the article "Local Girl Missing, Police Suspect Runaway." It was barely 2 paragraphs. No photo, no follow-up. Just another forgotten story buried under headlines about city council budgets and football scores. He read it over and over until the words blurred together. Somewhere, he knew, a mother had waited years for someone to care enough to look again. When the medical examiner's report came out, Ross asked Malcolm to meet her at the morgue. He didn't want to go, but curiosity gnawed at him. The room smelled of disinfectant metal, the kind of cold that sank into bone. Drawer. Naomi Chambers was waiting for them, a small woman with steady hands and the flat voice of someone who'd seen every kind of death. "The preservation work is unlike anything I've encountered," she said, flipping through the report. "It's a hybrid of embalming and polymer sealing. Whoever did this knew both mortuary science and taxidermy. He or she meant for it to last forever." She paused, looking them over her glasses. The hair growth you observed wasn't real growth. As the tissues contracted, the follicles were pushed outward, making it appear longer. The illusion of life. Ross nodded, expression unreadable. "Any idea how long she's been gone?" "Based on chemical breakdown, 25 to 30 years, Chambers said. So likely since the mid-70s. She handed Ross a small evidence bag. Inside was a tag with faded handwriting, Commission 1976. Handle with reverence. The same phrase from the brass plate. Someone considered this art, Chambers said quietly. That's what chills me the most. After the meeting, Ross and Malcolm walked out into the drizzle. We traced the renter, she said. Name on the lease was Raven Fallon. Paid in cash, used a fake address near Macon. Died in a car accident in '82. She hesitated, glancing toward him. You ever hear of him before? Malcolm shook his head. Who was he? Taxidermist. Had a business license under Fallon Preservation Services. Specialized in memorial art pets. Sometimes people who wanted lifelike displays. But it looks like he crossed a line. Way past a line. She opened her folder and showed him a photocopy of a newspaper clipping. Local artist offers unusual memorials, preserves loved ones in timeless form. The photo showed a man in his 40s, thin, pale, eyes like pinholes of glass. Beneath the article was a quota. Death doesn't have to mean decay, Fallon said. It can mean permanence. Malcolm's stomach turned. That's him, Ross said. We think he abducted Amara shortly before renting the unit. He probably preserved her within days. We were checking for other cases that fit the pattern. Over the next month, the investigation widened. Old records surfaced, storage receipts, business cards, a few names scrawled in ledgers. Each led to another city, another disappearance. Kids from Birmingham, Jackson, Memphis. All black, all between 10 and 13, all written off as runaways. Ross brought Malcolm updates when she could. He'd stopped feeling like a witness and started feeling like someone trapped inside the story. The faces of those children, the silence of those police reports, the word runaway stamped again and again, it all clung to him. One evening Ross came by after hours. She looked pale, clutching a folder to her chest. We found something else, she said. A journal. Hidden in a false bottom of one of the crates. She set it on his desk. The pages were brittle, water-stained, filled with cramped handwriting. The entries were short, clinical, like notes from a scientist. November 1975, acquired specimen. Skin tone exceptional, melanin preserves well. Another August 1977, subject nearly perfect, youth and purity captured before corruption. The words crawled across the page like something alive. Malcolm felt sick reading them. He called them specimens, he said quietly. Like they weren't even human. Ross nodded. There are 6 entries total, 6 completed works. We've confirmed 3 so far, all in different states. Fallon traveled for years, offering his services, moving whenever people started asking questions. He died before anyone connected the dots. She sank into the chair opposite him, eyes distant. It's strange, isn't it? How a man can disappear and still leave horror scattered behind him like breadcrumbs. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. The windows rattled. Malcolm looked at the journal again, at the precise loops of Fallon's handwriting, and felt a wave of anger that surprised him. Anger at the man, yes, but also at everyone who'd looked the other way. Who'd called a 12-year-old girl a runaway because it was easier than believing something terrible had happened. What happens now? He asked. Ross closed the folder and stood. Now we dig, and we keep digging until we find every one of them. She paused, her voice low. And maybe, just maybe, we make someone finally give a damn. After she left, Malcolm sat in the dim light of his office, listening to the rain against the roof. The old building groaned, and somewhere in the back hallway a metal door slammed shut on its own. For a moment, he thought he heard a faint sound, something like a child humming, just beyond the edge of hearing. He told himself it was the pipes. He told himself a lot of things. But deep down, he knew the truth. Some echoes don't fade. Some stories, once opened, keep breathing long after the box is closed. The morgue sat on the edge of downtown Atlanta. An old brick building with iron doors, and the faint chemical tang of formaldehyde drifting even outside on the steps. Detective Evelyn Ross stood smoking in the drizzle, watching rain carve thin lines down her windshield before flicking the butt into a puddle. She'd been on the job for 15 years. and thought she'd seen everything death could do to a body. But the girl in the crate, Amara Lewis, was different. It wasn't just that she'd been preserved. It was the intent behind it, the careful craftsmanship, the way her hair still looked soft enough to braid. Death didn't look that peaceful without help. It made Evelyn's stomach knot in a way crime scenes rarely did anymore. Inside Naomi Chambers was waiting, arms folded, standing over a stainless steel table. The girl lay beneath a thin sheet, her small frame dwarfed by the size of the slab. Evelyn hesitated before stepping closer. "You can look," Chambers said quietly. "She won't break." The detective lifted the edge of the sheet. Beneath, the girl looked like she was sleeping under glass skin, pale but intact, her lips faintly tinted, her expression serene. The polymer coating gave her a faint sheen, like porcelain. Evelyn felt a strange mix of awe and nausea. "How the hell did he do this?" she murmured. Chambers motioned toward a tray of instruments. He combined embalming techniques with polymer resin, possibly silicone or epoxy. The organs were removed and replaced with a chemical mixture I've never seen before. It stopped decay, but only temporarily. "It's breaking down now, which is why the hair appeared to grow." She paused. "I've seen trophy killers before. This is something else. It's ritualistic." Evelyn scribbled notes in her worn leather pad. "You were saying he treated her like an exhibit." "Exactly. Every stitch was deliberate. Whoever did this wanted to preserve her forever, like he thought he was saving her from time itself." The doctor's voice dropped to a whisper. He believed he was honoring her. That word honoring hung in the air, heavy and wrong. Evelyn closed her notebook. "No," she said. "This wasn't honor. This was ownership." The autopsy revealed more than just preservation. Tiny abrasions on Amara's wrists, bruising under the polymer layer, and faint traces of chloroform residue in her nasal passages. She hadn't died peacefully. She'd been taken, silenced, and turned into art. Evelyn had seen enough child cases to know what that meant: power, control, and obsession. The lab confirmed the chemicals used were rare compounds typically ordered by licensed morticians. Fallen must have known exactly what to buy and where. The invoices they found in his old records listed embalming supplies, shipped across state lines under different alias as R. Fallen, R. Finley, R. Fielding. The man reinvented himself every few years, hiding behind new business names, new towns, same sick habits. Back at her office, Evelyn pinned photos to her corkboard, Amara's school picture beside the crate, the missing persons report beside the old newspaper clipping of Fallen smiling beside a preserved cat. The contrast made her skin crawl. She tacked up maps of the southeast, dots marking storage units, workshop addresses, motel receipts. The pattern was unmistakable: Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, Georgia. He'd traveled the spine of the deep south like a pilgrim of death, leaving behind beauty twisted into silence. She drove out to Macon the next morning, where Fallen's last known workshop had stood. The building was long condemned, its windows busted, ivy crawling up the bricks. Inside, dust layered everything like snow. Rusted tools still hung from pegs, jars of cloudy chemicals lined the walls, labels faded but legible: formaldehyde, phenol, glycerin, resin. In one corner sat a workbench covered in plaster molds of faces, half-finished, lifeless masks of children. Evelyn stared at them until her throat went dry. There were small fingerprints embedded in the plaster, as if the subjects had still been moving when the molds were cast. She stepped outside and vomited into the weeds. The local sheriff met her there, a red-faced man with more belly than badge. He remembered Fallen, vaguely quiet type, polite, paid cash for everything. "Did some fancy work," he said, scratching his chin. "Folks said he could make a dead bird look alive again. Creepy fella, but not mean." Evelyn stared at him. "He murdered at least 6 children. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Can't say I ever heard of that. Never had no complaints." She walked away before she said something she'd regret. The following week, forensic techs pulled a partial fingerprint from the inside of the crate, old but intact. It matched Fallen's. They also found a single long hair embedded in the resin around Amara's wrist, dark brown male. Even after death, the girl had kept a trace of her killer. It wouldn't lead to prosecution. Fallon had been dead for 5 years, but Evelyn wanted the truth documented. Every page of the file would stand as proof that the system failed this child. She reached out to Amara's mother, Loretta Lewis, who still lived in the same small house in Mechanicsville. The porch sagged, paint peeling, but there were flowers everywhere, bright azaleas, as if someone had tried to paint over grief with color. Loretta opened the door in her nurse's uniform, eyes wary. "Detective Ross." Yes, ma'am, may I come in?" The living room was a shrine. Photos of Amara lined the mantel, school portraits, Christmas mornings, church recitals. A poster-sized missing person's flyer was pinned to the wall, edges curling with age. Evelyn sat on the couch, notebook in hand, feeling like an intruder. "We've identified your daughter," she said carefully. Loretta didn't move, didn't blink. "You found her." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "We did. She was found in a storage unit here in the city." "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Lewis." The woman's face crumpled, not into tears but into something deeper, relief mixed with agony. "I knew she didn't run away," she whispered. "They said she did, but I knew." She walked to the mantel, touching a photo of Amara in a Halloween costume, homemade fairy wings, purple tulle, a crooked smile. She was happy that week. She wanted to be a teacher, not disappear. Evelyn's throat tightened. "You were right, Ma'am. You were right all along." Loretta sat beside her, pulling a small notebook from a drawer. "This was her diary," she said. "I used to read it after she went missing, hoping for a clue. The last thing she wrote was about carving pumpkins with me." "You tell me, does that sound like a child planning to leave home?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, Ma'am, it doesn't." The two women sat in silence, the sound of rain tapping against the window like faint applause from the ghosts of the city. When Evelyn left that evening, she promised herself something. The case wouldn't end with Fallon's death. It would end when every one of those children was brought home. She drove back through downtown, the streets glowing orange under the sodium lights, and thought about the difference between murder and memory. One takes life, the other refuses to let it go. Somewhere out there, in another forgotten unit or abandoned barn, another crate was waiting. Another child was still sleeping under the weight of neglect. Back at the precinct, Evelyn filled her report. Victim identified as Amara Lewis, age 12, missing since October 1976. Cause of death, homicide via chemical suffocation. Suspect Raymond Fallon, deceased 1982. Modus operandi: preservation and display of victims as memorial art. She closed the folder, slid it into the solved drawer, and stared at it for a long time. Solved wasn't the right word. Not when a mother had waited 11 years for an answer. Not when 5 more children might still be waiting to be found. That night, as she locked her office, she thought she saw a shadow move past the frosted glass of the evidence room, a small figure, head tilted, braids swinging softly as if caught in an unseen breeze. When she opened the door, the room was empty, the air still except for the faintest scent of lilac. She stood there a long time before turning off the lights. Some cases never really close. They just stop being silent. Detective Evelyn Ross returned to her office long after sunset, the air thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. The case file on Raymond Fallon sat open under the desk lamp, its edges curling, every page a faint echo of the same question: how many? The man had been dead for 5 years, yet his shadow seemed to stretch through every cold case folder she opened. His obituary was nothing but a footnote in a small town newspaper: local craftsman killed in single vehicle accident on Route 10. No next of kin reported. That was it. No mention of the children, no hint of the horror he left behind. The article described him as a quiet man with a passion for art and restoration. Evelyn underlined the words until the ink bled through the paper. Quiet, yes, monsters usually were. The deeper she dug, the stranger the trail became. Fallon had lived in at least 7 states over 2 decades, moving from one rental workshop to another. He'd paid only in cash, registered no vehicles, left no digital trace. In one town, he was known as a taxidermist. In another, an artist of remembrance. His business names shifted like aliases in a spy novel. Fallen Memorial Works, Eternal Preservation, Southern Curios. Each location was the same story. He arrived, set up a small workspace, stayed 6 months to a year, then vanished overnight, leaving behind unpaid rent and sealed boxes. The pattern wasn't coincidence. It was ritual. Evelyn requested the old accident report from Alabama State Police. When it arrived by mail a week later, the photos inside made her skin crawl. The wreckage was nearly unrecognizable: a burned-out van, twisted metal, a half-melted license plate. Fallen's body had been charred beyond identification, confirmed only by dental records. The crash had occurred on a deserted stretch of highway, near the Talladega National Forest. Investigators ruled it an accident, likely fatigue at the wheel. But one detail in the report stood out: several sealed crates had been recovered from the crash site, their contents destroyed in the fire. The report described them only as art materials. Evelyn knew better. She drove to Alabama that weekend, to the tiny county where the wreck happened. The local sheriff's office was a one-story brick box with a flagpole out front and a Coke machine that hummed louder than the ceiling fan. Sheriff Dale Weaver looked at her with suspicion the moment she walked in. "FB?" he asked, glancing at her badge. "Just a detective from Atlanta," she replied. "I'm following up on a case involving a man named Raymond Fallen. You handled his accident in '82. Weaver frowned, rubbing his temple. "Fallen, Lord, that was years ago. Burned to a crisp, didn't he? Hell of a mess." He shuffled through some dusty filing cabinets and pulled out a yellowing folder. "Ain't much left to see. Car went off the road, hit a rock face, fuel tank blew. We found a couple boxes in the back, but they were mostly ash." Evelyn flipped through the report again. "These crates, what happened to them?" Weaver shrugged. "We tossed what was left. Nothing but burned wood and melted glass." "Why was it important?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He was a suspect in multiple missing children cases across several states. Those crates they contained evidence. The sheriff's brows rose, and for a moment, guilt flickered behind his eyes. "Damn," he muttered. "We just thought he was some weirdo artist. Nobody told us different." He leaned back in his chair, sighing. "You folks always come digging when it's too late." Too late. The phrase echoed through Evelyn's head as she drove back through the winding forest roads, rain smearing the windshield. Too late for Amara. Too late for whoever had been sealed in those crates. The thought that Fallen's art might have gone up in flames unrecognized made her grip the wheel tighter. She wondered how many parents had buried empty coffins, never knowing their children were hidden in plain sight, labeled as art. Back in Atlanta, Evelyn spent long nights combing through storage company archives, property records, even classified ads. One lead surfaced in an old trade magazine for morticians from 1978, a small ad read Finley Preservation honoring the beauty of life. Confidential commissions accepted. The address listed was in Jackson, Mississippi. She called the number printed beside it. It had long been disconnected. Still, she forwarded the information to the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. A week later, they called back. The address had belonged to a small workshop demolished in the 1990s, but in a nearby facility, a single unpaid storage unit under the name R. Finley still existed, untouched since 1981. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. She flew to Jackson with a small team and the local police chief. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of pine. Inside the unit, the light from her flashlight caught on dust motes swirling like ghosts. Wooden crates lined the back wall, identical to the one found in Atlanta oak, brass fittings, stamped with the same phrase of memorial art piece. One was empty, another half collapsed from rot, but a third was intact, its seal unbroken. The chief looked at her nervously. "You think?" "Yeah," she said, cutting him off. "Call forensics." When the lid came off, the room fell silent. Inside lay a boy, maybe 10, dressed in overalls and sneakers, his hands folded neatly across his chest. His face was waxed pale but peaceful, as if asleep. A faded tag on the lining read Commission 1977. The air was heavy with chemical rot. Evelyn had to step outside to breathe. She leaned against the wall, swallowing bile, the sound of the cicadas roaring in her ears. Another child found, another decade too late. The DNA later confirmed his identity: Marcus Talbot, missing from Birmingham, Alabama since 1977. His file, like Amara's, had been marked probable runaway. Evelyn's anger burned low and constant, a coal she couldn't put out. She visited Marcus's mother, now elderly and frail, living in a nursing home. The woman wept softly when she heard the news. "They said he just left," she whispered. "Said boys like him don't stay put." I knew better. Evelyn didn't know what to say. There was nothing that could fill the decades between loss and discovery. Each new lead brought another layer of the monster into focus. Fallon had hunted with precision, choosing cities with large black populations, where police budgets were stretched and attention was short. He called his victims subjects, his acts commissions. He targeted families living on the edge, single mothers, working-class households knowing their cries would be drowned out by indifference. The deeper Evelyn read his journal, the more she understood he wasn't just preserving bodies, he was preserving control. Every line oozed superiority, his language steeped in fetishized admiration for the purity of darker skin. As though he believed he was immortalizing beauty while erasing humanity. In early spring, a break came when the FFB's Vickup Unit Cross referenced Fallon's known aliases with storage rental records in Tennessee. One unit under R. Fielding had been seized in 1983 and sold at auction, its contents scattered. They tracked the buyer, a retired antiques dealer, who remembered one particular crate he'd sold to a prop house in Memphis. "The crate," he said, "had a little girl in it, but we thought it was some movie dummy." Evelyn and her team found it 3 days later, sitting in a film warehouse under a tarp. The girl inside was 13, her hair still braided with pink ribbons. Dina identified her as Shayla Barnes, missing since 1978. By then, the story broke in the press. Preserved children found across the South, artist linked to decades of murders. Reporters swarmed the precinct. The headlines called him the Mortician of the South. Evelyn hated that name. It turned horror into spectacle. For her, these weren't trophies. They were children robbed of breath, mothers robbed of closure. She started to wonder if justice could even exist for ghosts. One evening, after a long day of interviews, she sat in her car outside the precinct, staring at the rain pooling on the windshield. The faces of Amara, Marcus, and Shayla looked back at her from the folder on the passenger seat. She whispered their names under her breath, like a prayer. Somewhere in the city, she knew another crate waited, another small body resting in false peace. Fallon might have died, but the silence he'd built around his crimes was still alive, still feeding on neglect. Evelyn lit a cigarette, watched the smoke coil through the dark, and swore she wouldn't let it end that way. She would drag every one of those children back into the light, no matter how long it took. The morning Amara Lewis's DNA match came back, the city was still heavy with fog, the kind that seemed to press against windows and swallow sound. Detective Evelyn Ross stood in the doorway of the medical examiner's lab, clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Drawer. Nami Chambers looked up from her workstation, eyes grave behind fog glasses. "It's confirmed," she said simply. "Her name is Amara. The DNA matches her mother, Loretta Lewis." The words felt heavy, final. They should have sounded like victory, but they didn't. Evelyn nodded, setting the cup down on the counter. "We tell the mother today." Chambers sighed. "Do you want me there?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, this one's on me." The drive to Mechanicsville felt longer than usual. The neighborhood was quiet, rows of small houses that looked tired but stubbornly kept alive. Kids on bikes darted between puddles, their laughter cutting through the morning haze. Evelyn found the Lewis house easily, the same one she'd visited once before, but this time the front door was open, a gospel song drifting from inside. She stepped onto the porch, knocked gently, and waited. Loretta appeared in her nurse's scrubs, holding a dish towel, her eyes wary and expectant all at once. "Detective Ross?" she asked. Evelyn nodded. "May I come in?" The living room hadn't changed. Photographs filled every inch of wall space, Amara's smile repeated in a dozen frames. The air smelled faintly of lavender and lemon cleaner. Loretta motioned toward the couch but didn't sit. "You found her," she said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn took a breath. "Yes, ma'am, we did." The silence that followed felt alive, pulsing between them. Loretta's lips parted but no sound came out. Her hands twisted the dish towel until the fabric tore. Evelyn kept her voice steady, gentle. Her body was found in a storage unit here in Atlanta. She was preserved, kept in a kind of chemical state. I know that's a lot to process. For a moment, Loretta stood perfectly still, then sat slowly, as if her knees couldn't hold her anymore. "Preserved," she repeated, her voice hollow, like she was some kind of thing. Her eyes lifted, full of disbelief and pain. "Who would do that to a child?" Evelyn hesitated. "His name was Raymond Fallon. He's dead now. We think he may have been responsible for other disappearances, too." Loretta's shoulders shook, but she didn't cry yet. "They told me she ran away," she said softly. "They said she probably went to stay with family in Macon. They told me to stop calling." Evelyn lowered her gaze. "They were wrong, Mrs. Lewis. You were right to keep searching." Loretta let out a small, bitter laugh. "Right doesn't bring her back, does it?" She rose and walked to the mantel, touching the edge of a photo of Amara holding a paper crown on her birthday. She would have been 24 this year. I used to imagine what she'd look like now. Sometimes I dream she was still 12, still coming home from the library with her backpack and that silly purple sweater. Her voice broke. "I kept the sweater, you know. It's in her closet. Smells like dust now." Evelyn wanted to say something, but nothing fit. She delivered bad news before: murders, suicides, disappearances, but this felt different. This wasn't just loss. It was years of being dismissed, of a mother screaming into a void that refused to listen. Loretta turned, her expression hardening through the tears. "Do you know what they told me when I begged them to keep looking?" she asked. "They said black girls run away all the time. They said I was wasting their time. I told them my baby wasn't like that. She was smart, responsible, loved school. But they didn't care. They looked at me and saw some poor woman who couldn't control her kid." Evelyn felt heat rise in her chest. "I read the original report," she said quietly. "It was inadequate." Loretta barked out a short, humorless laugh. "That's a pretty word for what it was. Negligent, lazy. Maybe racist, if you want to be honest about it." She looked up, meeting Evelyn's eyes. "You're the first person who's ever come back. 20 years, and you're the only one who bothered to knock on this door." Evelyn swallowed hard. "I wish it had been sooner." They sat together for a while, the only sound the creak of the old clock on the wall. Finally, Loretta stood and disappeared down the hallway. When she returned, she was holding a worn notebook with peeling stickers on the cover. "This was hers," she said, handing it to Evelyn. "Her diary. I used to read it, hoping there was something inside that could tell me what happened." Evelyn opened it carefully. The handwriting was round and childish, filled with hearts and doodles. The last entry read, "October 17th, Mama said we'll go get a pumpkin tomorrow. I want to carve a scary face this time. Destiny says mine will win. I can't wait to show Mama." Evelyn closed the book, throat tight. She was excited for Halloween, she murmured. She wasn't planning to go anywhere. Loretta nodded. "No, she wasn't, and now she's been gone longer than she was alive." She sank back into the chair, the exhaustion of a lifetime settling into her bones. "You tell me, Detective, what do I do with that?" Evelyn didn't have an answer. She reached out and touched the woman's hand gently. "You don't do anything with it. You just keep living, and we'll make sure her story doesn't disappear again." Outside, the afternoon sun had started to burn through the fog. Evelyn stood by her car for a long moment, watching the light catch the edges of the wet pavement. She thought about Amara's diary, about the innocence of that last entry, It wasn't just a murder case anymore. It was an indictment of every file marked runaway, every case that never got the time or care it deserved. She drove back to the station and typed her report slowly, choosing each word like it mattered. Systemic neglect contributed to investigative failure. Racial bias apparent in initial assumptions. Recommend policy review. It was a small step, but it was something. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of rain returned, tapping against her apartment window like small hands. She poured herself a drink and stared at the board on her wall, 6 photos of children, now linked to Fallen. Each one with the same tired phrase scrawled across the bottom of their file, probable runaway. Evelyn crossed the words out with a black marker, one by one. No, she whispered, not anymore. The next morning, she received a call from a journalist who'd heard about the case. Detective Ross, the woman said, I'm writing about racial disparities in missing person investigations. I heard your department reopened one from the 70s. Evelyn hesitated. Yes, she said finally. But this isn't just one case. It's a pattern. Decades of silence. The reporter asked if she could quote her. Evelyn thought of Loretta's face of the photo on the mantel. No, she said. Quote the mother. Her voice deserves to be the one people hear. A week later, the story broke across every local paper. Murdered girl misclassified as runaway, systemic neglect exposed. The photo of Amara smiling in her purple sweater filled the front page. The article included Loretta's words, my daughter wasn't a runaway. She was taken, and they didn't care because she was black. The city stirred. People called the precinct, some in outrage, some in shame. Old detectives retired long ago found their phones ringing again, forced to confront the files they'd ignored. For Evelyn, it wasn't satisfaction, she felt it was a strange, quiet grief. The kind that came from knowing truth had finally surfaced, but far too late to matter. Still, something shifted. New funding was allocated for cold case reviews. Training programs were proposed for bias awareness, a start. Small, fragile, but real. On Sunday, Evelyn attended Amara's funeral. The church was full, neighbors, teachers, strangers who had read her story and come to pay respects. The choir sang Precious Lord, Take My Hand, and the sound rolled through the pews like a tide. Loretta stood at the pulpit, her voice steady even as her hands shook. They told me to move on, she said. But a mother never moves on. She moves forward, carrying the weight of what's been taken. My child mattered. Our children matter. When the service ended, Evelyn stayed behind, watching as people placed flowers on the small white coffin. She didn't take notes. There was nothing left to write, only to remember. Later, as she drove away, the evening sky blazed orange over the Atlanta skyline. In the rearview mirror, she saw the church fade into distance, a flicker of light among the shadows. For the first time in months, she felt something close to purpose. The dead couldn't speak, but the living could. And as long as she was breathing, Evelyn Ross wasn't going to let anyone forget the name Amara Lewis again. Detective Evelyn Ross woke before dawn, long before the city began to stir. Sleep had become a stranger lately, her mind replaying fragments of the case, like broken film reels, the faces of the children. The way the word runaway seemed to echo louder than any gunshot. She sat at her kitchen table with a mug of black coffee gone cold, staring at a folder spread open before her. The cover read simply Fallen, Raymond deceased. Inside were photos, reports, lists of evidence, and one grainy image of a man's face. Even on paper, he looked empty, as if the light behind his eyes had gone out long before his body followed. She'd studied killers before, but Fallen was different. He wasn't driven by rage or impulse. His violence was deliberate, performed like a ritual, precise to the millimeter. The longer she stared at his picture, the more she felt he'd been watching her back all along, grinning somewhere behind the fog of time. By mid-morning she was at her desk, reviewing a stack of leads that hadn't yet gone anywhere. Each one was a thread connected to a different city: Jackson, Birmingham, Memphis, Baton Rouge. Each city held its own ghosts. Fallen had moved like a whisper through them all, leaving just enough trace to prove he existed, but never enough to catch him. It was like chasing smoke. Still, there was a pattern forming a trail of missing children, all within the same 5-year span. All with families who'd been told not to worry. She pinned new photos to the corkboard beside Amara's, the college growing heavier by the day. Beneath each child's face, she wrote the words presumed runaway and then drew a line straight through it. Captain Alvarez called her into his office before lunch. The captain was a wary man who'd spent too long watching budgets shrink and headlines grow. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Ross, you've been living in this case," he said. "You're doing good work, but the brass is asking questions. You've been crossing state lines, pulling resources without formal clearance. We need to be careful how this looks." Evelyn folded her arms. "How it looks? Captain, this man murdered at least 6 children. He preserved them like trophies. And every one of those cases was ignored because of who those kids were and where they came from. You think I'm worried about how it looks?" Alvarez sighed, rubbing his temples. "You can't fix 20 years of bad policing in one investigation." "Watch me," she said quietly, and walked out before he could answer. That afternoon, a call came from the forensics lab. They'd recovered partial fingerprints and several unique chemical residues from the inside of Fallon's crates. The same compounds had appeared across multiple crime scenes, tied to missing children in different states. It was enough to formally reopen those cases and link them to Fallon. But to Evelyn, evidence wasn't the only thing she needed. She needed acknowledgement from the department, from the public, that these children had mattered. For too long, they had been the forgotten ones, the faces that never made the evening news. She decided to contact the families directly, starting with those whose children's names had surfaced in the journal found in Fallon's storage unit. Her first call was to Denise Johnson in Birmingham, whose son Marcus had vanished in 1977. The woman's voice trembled when she answered, brittle but proud. "Detective Ross," she said after a long pause. "I've been waiting for someone like you to call me for 30 years. Evelyn didn't speak for a moment. The weight of that sentence was unbearable. Denise described the day Marcus went missing, how the police searched for exactly 1 week before labeling him a runaway. They said he was hanging with the wrong crowd, she said. But he was 10, detective. 10 years old. His wrong crowd was the neighborhood kids playing stickball behind the school. Evelyn promised her they were doing everything possible to bring Marcus home. When the call ended, she sat in silence, gripping the receiver until her knuckles turned white. A few days later, she drove to the outskirts of Birmingham to meet Denise in person. The woman's house was small and tidy, walls lined with faded photos. She poured sweet tea and spoke softly, the way people do when they've carried grief so long it's become another piece of furniture in the room. "You know," she said, eyes fixed on a photo of Marcus, "they told me to stop putting up flyers. Said it made the neighborhood look bad. But I never stopped. Every year on his birthday, I printed more." Evelyn noticed the printer in the corner, an old clunky thing still stained with ink. "You kept it running all this time." Denise smiled sadly. "Hope's a habit I never could break." Back in Atlanta, Evelyn shared her findings with the FFB task force. Most of the agents were young, ambitious, their suits too sharp and their empathy too practiced. One of them, a man named Keller, leaned back in his chair and said, "So you retelling me this guy was basically a serial killer taxidermist?" "That's one hell of a story, detective." Evelyn fixed him with a look that shut him up immediately. "He wasn't a story," she said. "He was a symptom of something bigger than him." She pointed to the photos on the screen. "You want to understand Fallon? Don't look at him. Look at them. Look at how easy it was for him to move around, to pick his victims, to hide them. He didn't just rely on skill, he relied on the system not giving a damn." The room went quiet. Even Keller had nothing to say after that. That night, the air in the city was thick with summer heat. Evelyn drove without a destination, the windows down, the hum of cicadas filling the silence. Her thoughts spiraled toward the old cases, toward the children whose faces now followed her everywhere. She stopped at an old diner on the edge of the highway and ordered coffee she didn't need. The waitress recognized her from the news. "You read the detective working that art case, right?" she asked. "The one with the dolls." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "They weren't dolls," she said softly. The waitress looked embarrassed, muttered an apology, and hurried away. Evelyn stared at her reflection in the diner window, the neon lights painting her face in shades of pink and blue. She wondered how long it would take before people stopped turning tragedy into novelty. When she finally returned to her apartment, there was a message waiting on her answering machine. It was from a retired cop named Robert Morrison, the detective who'd handled Amara's disappearance in 1976. His voice crackled with age and something defensive. "Detective Ross, this is Morrison. Heard you've been reopening my old cases. Thought you might want to hear my side before you start pointing fingers." Evelyn listened twice, then called him back. They met the next day in a diner outside Macon, a neutral ground. Morrison was in his 70s now, gray and stooped, but still proud. He talked like a man trying to rewrite history. "We didn't have the resources back then," he said. "We had a lot of missing kids. We did what we could." Evelyn sipped her coffee, watching him over the rim. "You labeled a 12-year-old girl a runaway after 48 hours. No search, no canvassing, no follow-up. That wasn't lack of resources, detective. That was lack of care." Morrison's face flushed. "Don't sit there and judge me. You weren't there. The department told us to prioritize certain cases. We followed orders." "Orders that said whose children mattered," she replied. He looked away, and for a moment she thought he might cry. "We failed her," he said quietly. "We failed all of them." Evelyn nodded. "Yes," she said, "but we were not done yet." The meeting left her hollow but resolute. The next morning she filed formal requests to reopen all 6 cases tied to Fallon's timeline. She knew the bureaucracy would push back, that the department would worry about bad publicity. But she also knew something had shifted. The press was watching now. The public wanted answers. And she wasn't going to stop until she had them. Late that evening, as thunder rolled in from the west, Evelyn stood alone in the evidence room. The lights hummed faintly overhead. She ran her fingers along the edge of the crate that once held Amara's body, tracing the deep grain of the oak. The brass plates still read Memorial Art Piece 1976. She thought of Fallon's meticulous handwriting, of the phrase "handle with reverence." The words felt like mockery now. Reverence, he'd called it. But there was nothing sacred about what he'd done. Evelyn closed her eyes and whispered the names she'd learned by heart: Amara, Marcus, Shayla, and the rest still waiting to be found. Outside, lightning flashed, white and merciless, illuminating the city below. For a brief, impossible moment, the reflection in the glass beside her seemed to shift, not her own face, but a small one, framed by braids, eyes closed as if dreaming. When the light faded, the reflection was gone. Evelyn opened her eyes and breathed out slowly. "I see you," she said into the quiet. "And I'm not done." The discovery of Fallon's journal changed everything. Until that point, his crimes had felt like a puzzle, half-solved, horrifying. Yes, but fragmented. Scattered across years and state lines like broken glass. The journal gave it shape, gave it a voice, and that voice was cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of remorse. Detective Evelyn Ross sat at her desk, the small leather-bound book lying open before her. Its pages wrinkled from water damage and faintly stained with what she hoped was ink. Each entry was dated, numbered, and written with the precision of a scientist. March 1907, subject acquired. Female, age 11. Melanin tone excellent. Preservation potential high. He wrote about children like they were objects, specimens for study, their humanity reduced to texture and color. There were no names, only initials, no empathy, only admiration for what he called their eternal stillness. Evelyn had read plenty of killers' diaries before, rantings about divine missions, revenge, obsession, but Fallon's was something else. He believed he was an artist, a curator of innocence. Each page dripped with a warped sense of reverence. He wrote about how youth resists decay, how darkness in the skin absorbs the permanence of time. The language was almost poetic, and that made it worse. It wasn't the words of a madman foaming at the mouth. It was the calm reasoning of someone who truly thought he was creating beauty. As Evelyn read deeper, she realized he didn't see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a savior saving his victims from what he called the vulgarity of rot. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling, feeling a weight settle in her chest. The pages trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear but from anger. Follen's arrogance radiated through the paper, his tone that of a man who thought the world had never appreciated him enough. He described the process like a craftsman detailing his masterpiece, draining blood, removing organs, washing the body in a proprietary chemical bath. The care he took with their hair, the way he dressed them in clean clothes, arranging them as though dreaming. Evelyn could almost see him hunched over a child's body, humming to himself, convinced he was doing something holy. One entry stopped her cold. October 1976, Atlanta. Perfect specimen acquired. Small, delicate frame. Cooperative. Preserved successfully. Stored safely for display. The date matched the month Amara Lewis disappeared. Evelyn's throat went dry. Cooperative. The word lingered in her mind, awful and intimate. It implied conversation, trust, maybe even kindness before the end. Follen had lured her somehow, maybe posing as someone safe. The thought made Evelyn's stomach twist. She called Drew Chambers to cross. Checked the chemical notes in the journal with the evidence recovered from the crates. Chambers confirmed that Follen had developed a unique preservation formula, part embalming fluid, part resin, and something unidentified that left a faint crystalline residue. It was a mixture that required both medical training and years of experimentation. He must have tested it on animals first, Chambers said. Maybe smaller specimens before he moved on to humans. Evelyn nodded grimly. He perfected it on children. In the following weeks, Evelyn and her team worked with forensic document examiners to restore the damaged sections of the journal. Using ultraviolet light and chemical reagents, they coaxed faded ink back into visibility. More names surfaced, or rather more initials paired with cities and dates: SMMJ, Birmingham 1977, SB in Memphis 978, B, Denver 1980, TM Boys 1981, KP Las Vegas 1975. Follen had documented at least 6 subjects, each described with the same disturbing admiration. Every one of them was a child of color, all between the ages of 9 and 13. The consistency was undeniable, deliberate. He had a type, a twisted pattern hidden behind the mask of his art. Evelyn compiled the list and began cross-referencing national missing persons records. Within days, she found matches for every set of initials. The names that appeared on her screen formed a graveyard of neglect. Marcus Johnson, age 10. Shayla Barnes, age 13. Brianna Washington, age 11. Terrence Moore, age 9. Kendra Phillips, age 12. Each had vanished from a different state between 1975 and 1981, each case closed as a runaway within weeks. The files were thin, the investigations minimal. Reading them felt like being punched in the gut. She could almost hear the same excuses echoing across the years. They probably ran off. They always do. Her anger grew into something sharper, almost physical. Follen hadn't just preyed on children, he'd pried on a system that had made it easy. He'd understood that society looked away when certain children disappeared. He'd used that blindness as his camouflage. And in the cruelest irony, he'd left behind detailed notes, confident no one would ever raid them. He didn't hide because he didn't have to, Evelyn muttered under her breath. He knew nobody was looking. Late one night, she brought the journal home. She wasn't supposed to. Evidence was meant to stay in the lockup, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to keep reading. Needed to understand him if she was ever going to stop seeing his victims in her dreams. The rain beat against her apartment windows, the sound like static. She poured whiskey into her coffee mug and sat on the floor, under the yellow light of a single lamp. The next section of the journal was different. The handwriting changed, slanted, frantic. The entries grew shorter, more personal. The eyes haunt me, they don't close. I see them when I sleep, but they read beautiful. Eternal. Evelyn shivered. Even as his sanity frayed, Follen couldn't stop admiring his work. He was addicted to the stillness he created. The last pages were nearly illegible, written just months before his death. The road calls me south again. The collection must be preserved. They will be safe. I have found a new formula. The fire cannot touch it. Evelyn's brow furrowed. The fire cannot touch it. Was that a metaphor, or did he literally believe his formula could survive flames? The thought chilled her. Maybe those crates burned in the crash weren't destroyed completely. Maybe there were still remnants out, their traces of what he called his collection. She closed the book and stared out the window, watching headlights drift like fireflies through the wet streets. Somewhere below, the city carried on, cars honking, music bleeding from open windows, life moving forward as if nothing had happened. But Evelyn couldn't move on. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Follen's words burned across her vision, preserved successfully, stored safely for display. She thought of Amara, of Marcus, of the countless nameless children still missing. The journal wasn't just evidences. It was a confession written in the language of obsession. The next morning, she brought it to Captain Alvarez. He skimmed through a few pages, his face tightening. "Christ," he muttered. "You sure this is real? This reads like something out of a horror novel." "It's real," Evelyn said. "And it's bigger than just him. We're relooking at a pattern of institutional neglect that let this man operate for years. Every one of these kids was written off. We're reopening them all." Alvarez sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You about to piss off half the department." "Good," she said. "Let them be pissed." As she walked out of his office, she caught sight of herself in the window, tired eyes, hair pulled back in a messy bun, but something fierce burning behind her reflection. Follen was dead, but his story wasn't. His journal was a map, and she intended to follow it to every forgotten corner it led. She didn't know if she'd find more crates, more children, or just ghosts, but it didn't matter. The truth was finally speaking, written in a dead man's hand, and Evelyn Ross wasn't going to stop listening until every word had been answered. The investigation grew teeth after the journal's discovery. What had begun as one haunting case in Atlanta had spread like a stain across half the South. Each new lead exposed another thread of Raymond Follen's work, another child stolen, preserved, and hidden. The press called it the Children of Silence, a name that Evelyn Ross hated but couldn't deny had power. News vans parked outside the precinct, reporters shouted questions, and the phones rang day and night. Parents of long missing children began calling too, some hopeful, others terrified. Every call carried the same tremor of desperation. "Please, can you check if one of them was mine?" Evelyn listened to each one, promising to run the names through the system, though she already knew what she would find: too many disappearances. Too little done. The FBI assigned a liaison, Special Agent David Hunter, to help coordinate multi-state efforts. He was tall, methodical, the kind of man who treated evidence like gospel and emotion like interference. At first, Evelyn didn't trust him. He spoke about case load management and jurisdictional overlap as if this were a logistics problem rather than a graveyard of children. But he got results. Within weeks, he'd traced Follen's aliases to property rentals across 5 states, pulling dusty lease contracts and bank records that confirmed a trail of temporary studios and workshops. Each one told the same story: Follen would arrive quietly, pay cash, rent an isolated space, stay less than a year, and disappear. The neighbors never noticed much. He was polite, they said, kept to himself, always working on something artistic. Evelyn and Hunter drove to one of those addresses in rural Mississippi, a sun-bleached shed behind what had once been a funeral home. The building smelled of mildew and chemical residue even decades later. The walls were lined with jars of formaldehyde, taxidermy tools rusted to orange, and plaster molds of hands and faces that seemed to watch them as they moved. In the back corner, under a collapsed tarp, they found another crate identical to the other's oak, brass fittings. The same inscription burned into the lid. Memorial Art Piece, 1978. Evelyn's pulse quickened. They opened it slowly. Inside was a girl, maybe 11, her hair in tight curls, wearing a Sunday dress faded to gray. Her eyes were closed, her lips parted slightly as if she'd been about to speak. Evelyn had to turn away, pressing a hand over her mouth. Hunter muttered something under his breath, a curse swallowed by the silence. "That makes 4, he said grimly. 4 that we've found. God knows how many more." Forensics confirmed her identity days later. Brianna Washington, missing from Denver in 1980. How Fallon had moved that far undetected was a question Evelyn couldn't stop asking. She pored over bus tickets, motel ledgers, freight shipping records, anything that could show his path. It was like trying to reconstruct the flight of a ghost. But slowly, patterns emerged. Fallon had used small free companies to move his art pieces between states, labeling them as restoration materials or museum replicas. No one ever questioned it. No one ever opened the crates. He didn't hide in the dark, Evelyn said to Hunter one night as they drove back to Atlanta. He hid in plain sight. He counted on people's politeness, on their willingness not to look too close. Hunter nodded, eyes on the road, and he was right. The two of them became unlikely partners. Hunter's precision balanced Evelyn's intuition. He mapped data while she chased ghosts. Together, they visited families: Marcus Johnson's mother in Birmingham, Shayla Barnes's aunt in Memphis, Terrence Moore's grandmother in Boise. Each story was the same: a child vanished, police dismissed it, the families left to carry unanswered grief. Evelyn stopped wearing her badge during those visits. It felt wrong, like a reminder of the uniform that had once ignored them. She took notes quietly, asked about favorite colors, songs, the last thing each child had said before disappearing. Details mattered. They made the dead real again. One night, after visiting the Moore family, Evelyn and Hunter stopped at a diner just outside of town. The neon sign flickered above the windows, buzzing in the humid air. They sat in a booth, silent for a while. Finally, Hunter said, "You ever wonder why he picked them? Why these kids?" Evelyn stirred her coffee. Because no one would come looking. Because the world told him they didn't matter, and he believed it. She looked out the window at the empty parking lot, rain streaking the glass. Fallon didn't create this. He just took advantage of it. Hunter nodded, his expression unreadable. "You rewrite," he said. "But it's our job to make sure it ends with him." A week later, they got another hit: Tennessee. An abandoned property once rented by Fallon in 1979. This one a defunct photography studio on the outskirts of Memphis. When they arrived, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and old chemicals. In the basement, they found what had once been a darkroom. Red light bulbs still hung from the ceiling, the floor scattered with negatives, photos half developed and curling from moisture. Evelyn lifted one with gloved hands, holding it up to the dim light. It was a photograph of a young boy sitting cross-legged, smiling uncertainly. His clothes were different from the other victims, newer, cleaner. Beneath the photo, Fallon had scrawled a single word in pen: timeless. There were dozens of similar photographs. Children posed like portraits, their expressions caught between fear and confusion. The photos were labeled with dates and initials. One matched a missing child from Boise, T.M. Terrence Moore. His crate was found sealed in a back room behind a false wall. The same craftsmanship, the same quiet horror. Evelyn didn't cry, or she couldn't. The grief had calcified into resolve. The press descended on the story like vultures. Cameras flashed as officials carried out the crates. The images splashed across every news channel by morning. Serial preservationist exposed, one headline read, "Another art of death: how America ignored its missing children." Evelyn refused interviews, but the noise made her investigation harder. Politicians called for oversight. Retired officers defended their old departments, and families demanded accountability. Captain Alvarez warned her to keep her head down. "They're gonna make you the face of this," he said. "Hero or villain depends on who you ask." Evelyn didn't care. "Let them," she said. "As long as people remember the kids." By summer, they'd identified all 6 of Fallen's known victims. Their remains were returned to their families, each funeral drawing larger crowds than the last. Mourners carried candles and photographs, chanting names that had been forgotten for decades. The press eventually moved on, but the echoes stayed. Evelyn found herself attending each funeral, standing at the back of the church, unseen but present. She told herself it was closure, but it wasn't. Closure was a myth. All she could offer was an acknowledgement, a kind of belated dignity. Then, one night in late August, Hunter brought her new evidence, a set of Negesev recovers from a collector in Louisiana. They appeared to be Fallen's early work portraits of children, never matched to any missing person report. Evelyn studied them one by one, the air thick with unease. "These might be more victims," Hunter said quietly. "Or potential ones." She leaned back, eyes burning. Then he didn't stop. The crash didn't end it just paused it. As the storm outside rattled the windows, Evelyn stared at the faces of the unknown children. Their eyes looked straight into the lens, into her. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, a whisper of something between anger and sorrow. Fallen's body was gone, but his shadow remained, stitched into the corners of every neglected file, every case left unanswered. She turned off the light and gathered the photos into a folder. "We'll find them," she said softly, mostly to herself. "Every last one." When she finally left the office, the city was drenched in rain. Streetlights glowed in puddles like fractured stars. She walked to her car slowly, the sound of thunder rolling overhead. In that brief moment of quiet, before the next flash of lightning, she thought she heard it again, the faintest hum of a child's voice. Like a song carried on the wind. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Some ghosts, she knew, followed not to haunt, but to remind. The storm that swept through Atlanta that September felt biblical, as if the sky itself was trying to wash something clean. Detective Evelyn Ross sat in her car outside the Lewis home again, rain hammering the windshield so hard it blurred the world into streaks of silver. She'd come to see Loretta because she couldn't bring herself to make another phone call. The investigation had grown into something vast and ugly, a network of forgotten files, unspoken prejudice, and ghosts that refused to stay buried. But through it all, Loretta had remained a constant, a mother who never stopped demanding that her daughter's name be spoken aloud. Evelyn climbed the porch steps and knocked softly. The door opened before she could knock again. Loretta stood there, hair wrapped in a scarf, eyes tired but steady. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said. "Come in, detective. I made coffee." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and rain. The same photos still lined the mantel, but now new ones joined them, pictures from the press, children who'd been found, stories that had finally been told. Loretta poured 2 cups and handed one over. "I saw the news," she said, her voice even. "They said they found more kids. More like my Amara." Evelyn nodded, staring into her coffee. 6 that we can prove, maybe more. We're still checking." Loretta leaned back, the lines on her face deepening. "I keep thinking about all those mothers," she said. "All those families who stopped calling because nobody listened. I used to think maybe I was crazy for not letting go." Evelyn met her gaze. "You weren't crazy. You were right. You were one of the only ones who was." Loretta smiled faintly. "That's not comfort, detective. That's just the truth." She looked toward the window where lightning flickered in the distance. "You know, I used to hate the rain," she said softly. "Because that night, it was raining. The night she disappeared. I always thought maybe, if I'd picked her up instead of letting her walk, maybe if I hadn't been working late, she'd still be here. But then I think he would be found another child. Somebody's baby was going to be taken, no matter what I did." Her voice cracked then, just slightly. That's the part I can't forgive the world making it so easy for men like him. Evelyn listened in silence. There was nothing to say that didn't sound like apology, and apologies didn't heal anything. After a while, Loretta stood and fetched a small cardboard box from the shelf. "I've been meaning to show you this," she said. Inside were dozens of letters, old, folded papers, faded photographs, newspaper clippings. People been writing me since the story came out. Mothers, fathers, even teachers. They tell me about their missing kids. Some thank me for speaking up. Some just want someone to listen. She pulled out one letter written in even handwriting. "This one's from a woman in Jackson. Her boy disappeared in 1979. Police told her he was probably dealing drugs. He was 11. Evelyn felt the air thicken in her chest. "We were still working through all the names," she said quietly. "There might be more victims." Loretta nodded, eyes sharp. "I know. But what you really fighting isn't just him, detective. You fighting the silence." The rain slowed outside, softening into a steady rhythm. Evelyn sipped her coffee, feeling the warmth settle into her bones. "I came here to tell you something," she said. "We're setting up a memorial one for all the children. Not just Amara, but Marcus, Brianna, Shayla, all of them. There'll be a plaque downtown by the old courthouse. It'll all have their names." Loretta's eyes glistened. "About damn time," she murmured. "Do you know how long it's been since anyone said my daughter's name in a courtroom?" Evelyn shook her head. "Too long." They sat together in the quiet, two women connected by loss and persistence. When Evelyn finally stood to leave, Loretta followed her to the door. "You keep doing what you redoing," she said. "Even when they stop caring again. Because they will, you know. They always do." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. "I know, but not if I can help it." As she stepped out into the cool air, Loretta called after her. "You find the rest of them, detective. You bring them home." Evelyn turned back, rain dripping from her hair. "I will," she said. The next day, she stood before the city council, flanked by reporters and cameras. The memorial proposal had become a public battle. Some officials wanted it buried quietly, citing budget constraints and unnecessary controversy. Evelyn's voice carried across the chamber like a blade. These children were not statistics. They were citizens. Their deaths were ignored because of the color of their skin and the poverty of their neighborhoods. We failed them then. Don't fail them again now. When she finished, the room was silent. A few council members shifted uncomfortably, but one, a young black woman named Angela Monroe, spoke up. "Detective Ross is right," she said. "This city needs to remember, and it needs to do better." The motion passed unanimously. Weeks later, the memorial was unveiled in the heart of downtown. It wasn't grand, just a smooth wall of black granite etched with names. But it drew a crowd that stretched around the block, families holding candles, strangers standing shoulder to shoulder. Evelyn stood near the back, away from the cameras. Loretta spoke at the podium, her voice calm but steady. "For years, we were told our pain didn't matter," she said. "But today, we stand here to prove that it does. Our children are not forgotten. Their names are written in stone." The crowd murmured amen. Evelyn felt her throat tighten as Loretta turned toward her, just for a moment, and nodded. After the ceremony, Evelyn lingered by the wall long after everyone else had gone. The city lights reflected in the polished stone, each name glimmering like a constellation. She ran her fingers over Amara's name, the grooves cool beneath her skin. "You home now?" she whispered. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. It was Hunter, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't leave you here alone," he said. "You look like you needed this." She took the cup with a faint smile. "You ever think it's strange?" she asked. "All these names finally carved into stone, but we still don't know how many more are missing." Hunter looked at the wall, his reflection overlapping hers. "We may never know," he said. "But it matters that we tried." They stood there for a while in silence, the hum of the city softening around them. When Hunter left, Evelyn stayed. She thought about the letters Loretta had shown her, the voices of other parents still waiting, still hoping. She promised herself she would answer every one. No more silence. That night, back in her apartment, she opened her case files again. Fallen's journal lay at the center of her desk, surrounded by stacks of new correspondence. She flipped to the last page, where his handwriting trailed off into nothing. She took her pen and wrote beneath it, in firm, deliberate letters, "For every child you took, there will be someone who remembers." Then she closed the book for the last time. Outside, the city lights blinked against the dark, and for the first time in months, Evelyn allowed herself to breathe. She knew the fight wasn't over, would never be, but for now, there was quiet. Not silence, but something gentler. The kind of quiet that comes when the dead are finally heard. The night before the Amara's Law vote, Detective Evelyn Ross sat in her car outside the courthouse, watching the glow from the streetlights dance across the wet asphalt. It had been nearly 2 years since the first crate was found, and she still hadn't learned how to let her shoulders drop. The case was technically closed, Fallen dead, the victims named, the evidence sealed, but the aftermath kept unraveling in new directions. Reporters still called weekly. Politicians attached their names to the legislation that her investigation had sparked, and advocacy groups were already planning rallies and press conferences. Everyone wanted to own a piece of the story now. Evelyn didn't care who got the credit as long as the law passed. The bill was simple. Every missing child report, regardless of race or background, would trigger an immediate and equal level investigation. No more labeling them as runaways without proof. No more waiting days that turned into years. It wasn't justice for the 6 children she'd found, it was prevention for the ones who might still be saved. Inside the courthouse, she met Loretta Lewis in the hallway. The older woman wore a deep blue dress, her hair silvered since the last time they'd spoken, but her posture carried the quiet dignity of someone who had finally found her place in history. "You ready?" Loretta asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Ready as I'll ever be." The 2 women entered the council chamber together, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The room was packed: journalists, community leaders, families of the victims, faces from across decades of loss. Photographs of the 6 children were displayed along one wall, framed in black. Amara's picture was in the center, her smile frozen in time, the heart of everything. As the meeting began, the air felt charged, a mix of tension and reverence. Councilwoman Angela Monroe took the floor first. She spoke of accountability, of rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. "These children," she said, gesturing toward the photos, "were lost twice, first to a killer, then to a system that refused to see them. We can't undo the past, but we can make damn sure it never happens again." Applause rippled through the room. When she finished, she invited Evelyn to speak. The detective hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the podium. She wasn't used to speeches. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "For years, I carried a file that should have been solved decades ago. A file that began with a single missing girl and ended with the discovery of something too awful to imagine. But this story isn't mine, it belongs to them. To Amara Lewis, Marcus Johnson, Shayla Barnes, Brianna Washington, Terrence Moore, and Kendra Phillips. Their names should have been shouted from every station, printed on every front page. Instead, they were filed away under words like runaway and unconfirmed." She paused, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. "We can't give them back their lives, but we can make sure that every child, no matter where they come from, matters enough to be looked for." When the vote was called, the chamber went silent. One by one, council members raised their hands. The motion passed unanimously. For a moment, no one moved. Then applause erupted, echoing off the marble walls. Loretta covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. Evelyn didn't smile, not quite, but something inside her finally loosened. As the applause washed over her, she looked toward Amara's picture on the wall and whispered, "We did it, kid." Outside, the press waited under umbrellas, cameras flashing in the mist. Evelyn stepped to the microphone briefly, though she hadn't planned to. Amara's law isn't just about one case, she said. It's about the children who were overlooked, and the ones who never will be again. The law doesn't erase what happened, but it gives us a chance to do better. That's all any of us can ask for. She stepped away before the questions could begin, leaving the noise behind her. Loretta followed, looping her arm through Evelyn's as they descended the courthouse steps. You did good, Loretta said. No, Evelyn replied. We did good. The months that followed felt like waking from a long, heavy sleep. The memorial downtown became a gathering place, a wall of black granite where people came to leave flowers, letters, and photos of loved ones still missing. Evelyn went often, never in uniform. Sometimes she found other visitors standing quietly before the names. Once, she saw a group of school children tracing the engraved letters with their fingers, whispering the names like prayers. That was when she realized what they had created wasn't just a monument, it was a promise. In December, a national conference on missing persons invited Evelyn to speak. She almost turned it down. Talking about the case still made her feel raw, like picking at a wound that hadn't healed. But Hunter convinced her. People need to hear it from someone who gave a damn, he said. Not just another suit quoting statistics. So she went. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of officers, social workers, and advocates, she didn't talk about Fallon or the details of his crimes. Instead, she talked about the small failures that add up, the unchecked bias, the lazy assumptions, the files left in drawers gathering dust. We all think monsters hide in the shadows, she said, but sometimes they thrive in the spaces where no one's looking. The audience was silent, leaning forward, listening. For once, she didn't feel like she was talking into the void. By spring, the FBI officially closed the Fallon investigation, declaring all known victims accounted for. The media called it justice at last, but Evelyn hated that phrase. Justice wasn't something that arrives. It was something you built, brick by brick, and it was always incomplete. She kept working cold cases anyway, poring over forgotten files late into the night. Every time she opened a new folder, she thought of Loretta's words, "You refighting the silence." A year after the law passed, Evelyn returned to Mechanicsville for the dedication of a new community center named after Amara Lewis. Children played outside on the fresh, painted basketball court, their laughter cutting through the air like music. Inside, Loretta stood beside a plaque that read, "For every child who was told they didn't matter." The room was filled with life music, conversation, the hum of something healing. Loretta caught Evelyn's eye and smiled. "I thought this day would never come," she said. Evelyn looked around. "You made it happen." "We all did," Loretta replied. That night, Evelyn drove back through the city, passing the storage facility where everything had begun. It was shuttered now, overgrown with weeds, the sign faded and broken. She parked outside for a while, watching the dark outline of the building. In her mind, she could still see the wooden crate, the brass plate, the sleeping girl who had started it all. "You woke us up," she murmured, "and we still awake." As she pulled away, the radio played an old gospel tune, low and distant, the kind Loretta used to hum under her breath. The rain started again, soft against the windshield. For the first time, Evelyn didn't mind it. The sound felt less like grief now, more like renewal. The ghosts had quieted, not because they were forgotten, but because they'd finally been heard. Weeks later, she returned to the memorial wall with a fresh bouquet of lilies. She laid them beneath Amara's name and stood for a long moment, her reflection merging with the carved letters. The city around her buzzed with life, cars, laughter, the rhythm of a world still moving forward. Evelyn whispered, "Sleep easy, sweetheart. We're still fighting for you." Then she turned toward the sunlight breaking through the clouds and walked away. The sound of her footsteps steady, certain, fading into a day that finally felt alive again. The story of the Sleep of Ivory is not simply a tale of horror or crime. It is a mirror held up to the soul of a society that too often chooses silence over compassion. Beneath the chilling surface, the preserved children, the monster who called himself an artist. The years of unanswered grief lies a deeper question. How does a world allow certain lives to disappear without notice? The true villain of the story is not only Raymond Follen, but the quiet machinery of indifference that made his crimes possible. It is a story about blindness, how institutions, communities, and even good people can look away from suffering when it does not touch their own reflection. The failure wasn't born of one man's madness. It was born of everyone's comfort. At its heart, the story is a requiem for the forgotten. Amara Lewis and the other children were not just victims, they were symbols of how easy it is for the powerless to vanish when the world measures worth class, race, or convenience. The police reports labeled them as runaways, erasing their humanity with a single word. That word became a verdict, a quiet death before the real one. For decades, these children were ghosts walking through neglected case files, their families dismissed as hysterical or hopeless. Only when someone like Evelyn Ross, driven not by fame, but by conscience, decided to listen did their voices return. The story asks us to confront an uncomfortable truth that justice delayed is not merely injustice, but complicity. Every silence, every shrug, every closed file is a brick in the wall that hides the suffering of others. There's also a profound lesson about the power of remembrance. Follen sought to preserve his victims physically, believing that by halting decay, he could cheat time. But in doing so, he destroyed the very essence of what makes life sacred: the ability to change, to breathe, to move. His idea of immortality was grotesque because it was rooted in control, not love. In contrast, the mothers, the families, and finally Evelyn fought to preserve memory, not flesh. They understood that remembrance is not about freezing the past, it's about carrying it forward with honesty. To remember the dead truthfully is to restore their humanity. It's an act of rebellion against erasure. Loretta Lewis, standing at her daughter's grave, speaking Amara's name aloud, is the real act of preservation, the kind that heals rather than desecrates. The story also teaches that redemption does not come from vengeance but from transformation. Follen's death closed no wounds. The real healing began when the truth surfaced, when the system that had failed those children began to change. Amara's law wasn't a miracle, it was a reckoning. It forced a nation to confront its apathy, to admit that justice had always been unevenly distributed. Through the persistence of one detective and one mother, the story transforms from a narrative of despair into one of defiance. It reminds us that progress often begins not with heroes in uniform, but with ordinary people refusing to accept silence as the final word. Evelyn Ross did not seek glory as she saw truth, and in doing so, became the voice that the system had stolen from those mothers. There is another layer to the story, an intimate one, about how grief shapes identity. For Loretta, loss became both burden and purpose. For Evelyn, the case exposed the fragility of the line between duty and humanity. Every photograph, every recovered child chipped away at her professional detachment, until she could no longer pretend that justice was only a job. Through her, we see how empathy is not weakness, it's resistance. It's the willingness to feel, even when feeling hurts. The story shows that the strongest people are not those who bury emotion, but those who let it guide them toward action. The Sleep of Ivory also challenges the myth of closure. The funerals, the memorial, even the passing of the law, none of these erase what was lost. Closure is a comforting illusion. The truth is that grief never disappears. It reshapes itself into something quieter, something that must be lived with rather than defeated. When Evelyn stands at the memorial wall and whispers, "You rehome now," she isn't saying the pain is over, she's acknowledging that some pain must become part of who we are. The story teaches us to carry sorrow not as a wound, but as a compass pointing toward compassion. And yet, for all its tragedy, there's hope running through the story like a thin golden thread. Hope is in Loretta's persistence, in Evelyn's refusal to give up, in the community that finally gathers to say the children's names aloud. Hope is in the act of remembering what others tried to forget. The final scenes, the laws passing, the laughter of new children at the community center, do not erase the past. But they illuminate what can be built in its shadow. The world does not heal by pretending horrors never happened. It heals by learning to see them clearly and choosing differently next time. The moral weight of the story lies in accountability, not just for one killer, but for a culture that often decides whose pain deserves urgency. It's a reminder that neglect can be as lethal as violence, that apathy is a form of cruelty. To ignore suffering is to side with the one who causes it. Every institution, from the police to the press, has a choice to look away or to look harder. And every individual has that choice, too. The story whispers to the reader, pay attention. Listen when someone says their child is missing. Believe them. Because indifference is what monsters count on most. In the end, The Sleep of Ivory teaches us that justice is not about punishment, it's about restoration. It's about giving back names, stories, and dignity to those the world forgot. It tells us that truth, however painful, is the first act of mercy. The past can't be undone, but it can be faced, and in facing it, we reclaim part of our shared humanity. Evelyn Ross's final gesture, leaving flowers at the memorial, speaking to the dead as if they were still listening, is the culmination of that lesson. It's a quiet affirmation that remembrance is resistance, that empathy is strength, and that the dead live on as long as someone is willing to keep saying their names. Ultimately, the story's lesson is both simple and profound. Justice is not found in the courtroom or in the punishment of evil, but in the courage to care. It is a story about seeing, about what happens when we stop looking away. Because when a society learns to value every life equally, to listen to every voice regardless of color or status, it becomes something closer to humane. That is the promise left behind in Amara's name. Not peace, not closure, but awareness. The story leaves us with the understanding that the real work of justice begins only after the headlines fade, in the small, relentless acts of compassion that ensure no one, ever again, becomes invisible. If you enjoy stories that make you think twice before turning off the lights, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still many things left unsaid, and we'll continue exploring them together.